and traditional warrior practices. This is a real grounding process, we believe, that is good for our warriors veterans to understand. That the thing that I guess we need to put out is that when we do these modules, or we're invited to do these modules, we consult with local veterans in designing how their ancestral stories and warrior practices are. So they end up being very specific to the tribes and communities that we go with. This is there's a Navajo design of a hornet toad, and it's a story about my people's way of viewing the hornet toad in and of itself. Next slide. Then there's some examples here of historical overview. I'm not going to spend a good amount of time covering them, but I think the primary thing here is that tribes developed ceremonies that healed physically, emotionally, socially, and spiritually. That's a key point here. Next slide. Warrior identity is something that we value. And Sean, you want to talk about this?
Okay, so a lot of times what happens is that people are always kind of considered, it's like, well, what do we call women who are warriors as well? And it's like, well, they would be warriors. There wouldn't really be a difference between male and female as warriors, because within a history of Native American warfare, it's like they utilized both men and women also played a big role with that. So like what it says here, with some tribes, males and females given warrior names early in life. And a lot of times when we look at our Indian names, in a sense, is that they describe us, but also a lot of times those names even hold a power. They hold like something that helps and guide us in life. Because, for instance, it's like my Indian name is Kiyukak, and it has to do with a bear who's always searching, who's always looking for answers, who's always looking for this and that, but it doesn't really stop. So, and really, I mean, after a while, later on in life, I realized that it really describes how I am, because I've always been looking for knowledge. I've always been looking for things, and I just don't stop. It just keeps going on, you know. And so weapons were learned early in life, but weapons were not always weapons. They were more like a tool. Like even when we look at the history of, let's say, a club, or for instance, you know, they were tools, much like a hammer would be. And a lot of times they could hunt small game, they could knock out something in order to, you know, or to break different branches or things like that. It was more of a tool. So boys wrestle to become skilled and agile. Of course, there are women who would do that as well. I mean, we see a lot of Native, our youth are, you know, they're a little more active. A lot of times it seems like a little more, you know, maybe more playful in a sense than a lot of others are. That's what I've noticed. And a lot of times outside cultures may look at that as being something else than what it is. But the big thing is that the warrior identity is not just for males. Next slide. Okay, so for the historical overview is pre-contact. The history of Native Americans goes way back to at least the 1528 with the Appalachian resistance to the Spanish. And a lot of times they would coming out of Cuba. They would have hand-to-hand combat, was kind of the norm. But a lot of times what they realized is that Native Americans within their battle also use what they call a flanking motion, a maneuver within fighting and stuff like that, where one is you have a front where the people are coming at you, but you also have others who come across. And a lot of times it's something they've noticed with a lot of Native warfare, is that that's part of the strategies that we utilize. But one thing we do kind of look at this is also from more of a traditional like hunting practice. Is a lot of times you might have people who are pushing animals or game to a certain area and others waiting in order to be able to take the game. Okay, next slide, please.
In this objective, we have where we describe characteristics of native warrior. Our purpose here is to discuss what traditional characteristics of native warriors were, looking historically, oftentimes, like I mentioned, by tribe. But in this section, we spend some time on this. Next slide, please. Some reasons native engaged in conflict before colonization were these key reasons here that are described. Is almost always defense of the tribe and the family, and also excelling as a warrior. So those are two key features and the reasons why warriors conducted themselves the way they did. Next slide. There's some attributes associated with being a warrior, not a soldier, but a warrior. And a lot of respect was placed upon whom the opponents were, who the other tribes were that were engaging in conflict. And as my brother Sean talks about often, bravery and the ability to engage in conflict was highly regarded and among all our people. Next slide, please. Want to go ahead and touch on this, Sean?
You're muted, Sean.
Sorry, I was muted. A lot of times with the leadership within tribes, it was not always just one leader all the time. They had different leaders at different times, depending upon what was going on. If there was warfare going on, of course, then they would have a war chief in charge. At times of peace, they would have somebody who conducts things in peace. At times, maybe agriculture, or gathering, and things like that, planting seasons, they might have somebody who has that expertise in that. And a lot of times, it's like these might have been certain clan systems, as well as certain families that held that kind of knowledge within that. So a lot of times, these leaders were very highly respected. Of course, a peace leader would be somebody who's going to be going out there and making sure that everybody's kind of getting along and stuff. And these were definitely highly respected because you have to be able to have the knowledge and the respect and everything else like that from surrounding peoples. Next slide, please.
The objective 3, we go into more of a contemporary mode of describing the history of Native soldiers, looking at how from colonization this way, our people engaged in becoming soldiers within the military, whether they be French, English, or American. And so our purpose here is to describe how we fought along Europeans since the beginning of colonization, particularly in these branches of the armed forces. Next slide. We offer a quick historical overview here, but want to mention that what we're going through in this time that we have is a real short, small part of the overall module. We do this training over a two or 3 day period. So the content you're seeing is just a tip of the surface. So you can imagine how much deeper that the content goes. Next slide. Sean, you want to get into this?
Yeah, following from the other slide, we show that a lot of times with British, English, these French troops, they were taught in warfare to be able to line up against each other. They called that the thin red line, and they would take volleys at each other. But a lot of times they took heavy losses, but they thought that warfare was superior. When they began to fight with the natives, they utilized the same kind of warfare against natives. Yet at first they thought we were cowards because we wouldn't fight like them. But over time, the way that natives fought, and they called it guerrilla warfare, is that using kind of what it describes as little war.
Mm.
And within like the military today, we might call those like, when people are on patrols, they set up ambushes and things like that to be able to hit the enemy hard and then leave. And a lot of times they use ambushes, sabotage, raids, petty wars, hit and runs, a lot of mobility. They can utilize a smaller force to be able to fight a larger force. One of the biggest things is that it causes fear in the enemy. Now, a lot of times we look at a lot of things within the military today, and we see like for instance, let's say, look at snipers. Okay, the first target, number one target of a sniper is not officers. The number one target is communications. And the next target is like sergeants and things like that who are in charge of the troops. Because normally within the military, top down, the leaders, in a sense, officers, talk to maybe lower kind of officers, and those officers talk to the NCOs and the sergeants and things like that. And then the sergeants are the ones who's controlling the men, or the soldiers, that you would say. But they realize that taking out these kind of leaders causes fear, disorientation, confusion, exhaustion, because they never know when they're going to get hit, for one thing. And by taking out certain key people within the soldiers' kind of hierarchy, it disrupts them. But after a while, it came to be utilized in the shaping of special operations within the military insurgencies, which then went into the Rangers. And a lot of times they were utilizing natives to be able to teach them how to fight, or they would find young boys or children who were kept by natives, and they learned that way, and to be able to teach others how to fight that way. And out of that came the Rangers. Next slide, please. Okay, so after the Rangers, after a while, they began to be able to have the Indian Scouting Service. They were already using Native Scouts in many other things before, because what happens is when they go into another Native area, the soldiers didn't know how each one fought, but the surrounding tribes knew exactly how each tribe fought. So it gave them an advantage by gaining information from those natives that were utilizing. But in 1886, a bill was passed to establish the Indian Scouting Service. During that time, they had developed a battalion of Pawnee Scouts. Scouts were used in Texas and with the Seminole, the Southern Plains, the Ponca, Osage, Otos, Apaches, later on the 1870s. But from their value came scouts, the cavalry, sharpshooters, and then 2,000 natives were placed in the regular armed forces later on. But the ISS was disbanded in 1943, but what came out of the Indian Scouting Service was the Special Forces. And a lot of times when I was in Well, when I was in Fort Bragg, I was able to work in this special forces office for a little bit. And during that work, they let me read a lot of things, and they had all this stuff all over the walls, and they gave a lot of respect to the natives and how they learned how to fight that way. Next slide, please. Okay. Right.
Mhm. There's some information that we cover on numbers of Native Americans who served in different periods of war, like World War One. Next slide. We touch on code talkers. Most tribes had code talkers within the tribal tribes that served in the different theaters of war from as far back as we can remember. But more recently in the World War One, there were a lot of tribes that had code talkers. So we spent some time discussing this. Next slide. And as John mentioned, women having warrior roles were very common and very common. And today, many more of our young women are joining the armed forces and having combat roles, as our people have historically fulfilled roles. And we've had Native women killed in action also. Next slide. Korean War, happened, and 194 Native Americans were reported to have died in battle during the Korean War. Next slide. Vietnam, a lot of Native Americans served, volunteered during that conflict at a time when we had the draft in place. Estimates are that 25% of Native Americans who are eligible to join the military did that. And there are 5 Native Americans who received the Medal of Honor during the Vietnam War. Next slide. The Congressional Medal of Honor, since that award has been given, 29 of the recipients have been Native American. Next slide, please. We get to objective 4, the characteristics of Native soldiers. And our purpose here is to create an understanding of Native warrior practices and European warfare practices. Next slide. Go ahead, Sean.
So here it describes reasons why many natives join the military. And this is not just males, but also females. Patriotism to the US, loyalty to the tribe, defense of the country, defense of the people and tribe, family, a warrior history, to honor their ancestors and stuff like that. Family history of military service, tribal warrior traditions, being successful, excelling as a warrior soldier, to be better than others. Next slide, please. So each soldier has their own reasons as well, but what does a veteran or active duty soldier describe as his or her reasons for joining the military? A lot of those that we did post were many of those. How does he or she view the role in the military? If a veteran does, he or she view their discharge, because a lot of times that can be it's life-changing for one thing. What does the veteran describe family military history? And a lot of times that may go even further beyond military into their people's own survival and defense of their people. And a lot of times when you're looking at this, there are still some units in the military that were used against natives in the past. So some of them, if they're in those units, they might not actually really respect that unit as much as they respect other armed forces or other units or the U.S. itself. Next slide, please. Okay, here we get into trauma, historical trauma, PTSD, right?
In the module 2, we have these 4 objectives, and in providing an overview of defining what trauma is. Oftentimes, our veterans coming into the presentations are not clear about the different forms of trauma that impact them and their families and the community. So we define trauma, then we get into adverse childhood experiences. It's well accepted that among Native Americans in particular, we have significantly higher incidences of ACEs in Native communities and families. Then we get into an overview of historical trauma, as Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart has taught us to do. And then the 4th module, the 4th objective is to provide an overview of post-traumatic stress syndrome. So this is how we've developed module 2 of the workshop. Next slide. In defining trauma, we look at the purpose. What is our purpose for defining trauma? Well, we believe that it's good to review what trauma is and how it is described across the mental health field, behavioral health settings. Next slide. We give a definition of trauma, the emotional responses, long-term reactions, physical symptoms. Next slide. And that trauma can be passed from family members, and trauma can be genetically impacted as well, and inherited. There's a lot of research these days on epigenetics, which really verifies that statement, and that we have intergenerational trauma, particularly in Native communities, and those can be traced back decades and centuries in our tribal and family histories. Next slide. Go ahead and click it one more time, just a graphic will show up. There you go. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I think most of you here realize or understand that this is occurring across Native country. Next slide. And we discuss acculturation and its impact on us as veterans and children of traumatized communities. Go ahead, next slide. We get to adverse childhood experiences, which is considered to be a key problem, especially now. I mean, gosh, yeah. Imagine what happens with the children in school yesterday, not just that school, but other schools. So I think this is a particular area of interest, concern to many of us today. Next slide. Continuing review of ACEs. Next slide. Next slide. The framework that ACEs is presented in. I want to remind everyone that this is just a sample of the many slides we have on these topics. So, next slide. Health disparities. Next slide. Lifespan impacts of ACEs. This is well described in this graphic, I think. Next slide. How do we overcome ACEs? Is an important topic. I'm one of those who believes that it's one thing to talk about the trauma and the adverse experiences, but we don't do is give equal time or even more time to the process of overcoming that trauma, healing from the trauma. And I think it's something that we'd like in our field, but we work on putting effort into touching on this with our veterans. Next slide. Objective 3. I think we lost Sean. Talking about historical trauma, here's our purpose. That Native Americans have generations of trauma that can be discussed for healing. The medicine wheel, thank you. Next slide. Sean, if you're around, send me a message. Send me a note. The definition of historical trauma was developed by Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart back in the late 1990s. Next slide. I'm going to spend a lot of time on this. We have, through the center, we have opportunity to present on these things in greater detail about, with our veterans especially, we feel that this is good topics to introduce to our veterans and the families and the communities, because at that level of our communities and families and veterans themselves, oftentimes they don't get exposed to this kind of information. Next slide. There are 4 components to the historical trauma model that is under discussed or not presented. And it's something that Dr. Braveheart has really strong concerns about. But there are 4 parts to the historical trauma model. One is confronting the history of trauma that all communities face, not just Native American communities, but across the world. And we're seeing this played out in a number of contexts, like Ukraine, 9/11, things like that. Once we discuss the trauma that we have encountered in our lives, in our communities, and we work on developing an understanding of what that trauma does to us, what has happened with that. And the third component that Maria talks about often is then beginning to release that pain. Yes, we understand, we go through the experience of talking about the trauma, we understand its impact on us, and now how do we get through that pain and then become healing people. And the 4th component that Maria emphasizes is transcending that trauma, being able to live a life that's good, that's healthy. And once we get to that, then we've gotten back on a sacred path. Then we can delve more into the trauma, confronting the trauma, but not in a traumatized way, but more of a healing way. Next slide. Some examples of confronting the trauma. Next slide. How do we understand the trauma's impact? Well, this is a framework that Maria and the Zucchini Network, a group of allies that Maria formed back in the 90s, understand how trauma impacts us. Next slide. Then we go have real in-depth discussions on how do we release that pain? What are some strategies that we can employ to feel better and not get stuck into grief, but move through a mourning process that is healthier for us. Next slide. Then transcending that trauma, physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually, going through that process of change and well-being that I think we all strive for ourselves and our communities, and definitely in the case of our veterans, for our veterans also.
Yeah, when we developed this medicine wheel, we wanted to take consideration of all different tribes. So here we kind of have it so with the rainbow part is people could pick, in a sense, which color they could go in each one of those directions, but also the 4 directions sign in the middle is that some of them only have the 4 directions. Some of them, which is a little more comprised of many of the tribes, is the circle, like the sacred circle. But also with the little circle in the middle is that part of placing not just 4 directions, but the 7 directions in a sense. So we have the 4 directions, or 6 directions, 4 directions: north, south, east, west, Mother Earth, the sky, and wherever we're at that moment. And that represents us in the center.
Next slide. Welcome back, Sean. I thought I'd lost you. Had me worried. Go ahead and take the part, buddy.
Okay, so as we were talking about with PTSD, is like here asked is like what kinds of problems can occur with people who have very, very bad experiences, as discussed. So a lot of times people report flashbacks, a lot of fear and memories and things like that. But one thing that we do like to kind of add in there is that a lot of times it may be, some can be due to our belief systems. When we have a certain belief system that says you cannot do this, and you're forced to do that anyway, out of defense or whatever it might be, that can cause some kind of stress and anxiety and stuff like that, but also with your belief systems. And that's something where it can really be disastrous in a sense. But I was in a unit once with this guy, and he was going to be a priest when he got out. And we would ask him, it's like, why are you in here if you're going to be a priest? He said that he wanted to be able to know from the veteran's perspective of how this really is. But he wasn't concerned about having to take a life if he had to. Of course, he said he would do that if he had to, but it's not that he wanted to. The thing about it is that what he said was that if I'm to go to war and I have to take a life, that life is not on me. What he described was from the church that they went to, or he was saying, it's like those governments who are over the people, those are the ones where that goes to, not the soldier itself. And that, so he was not worried about that. That's something I wanted to add in there. Next slide, please. Okay, so development of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, occurs after exposure to a traumatic event. However, not everyone exposed to trauma develops PTSD. There are several factors that have been identified through research that increases likelihood. So, and these factors are broken down into 3 categories: pre-trauma, paratrauma, and post-trauma. So pre-trauma are things that people might have gone through before that. Paratrauma is during the event, and of course, post-trauma is afterwards. So, and part of that is the more trauma that a person has in their life, the more likely of a chance they may develop PTSD later on. Okay, next slide, please. So pre-trauma, again, we're talking about before. Here it talks about female gender, people who are a younger age to exposure. These are things that make it more likely somebody can develop PTSD. Race and ethnicity, ethnic minority status, because of maybe what they've gone through from their status to the major population and other populations. Historic of trauma exposure, like what I've talked about, family history of psychotic disorders psychiatric disorders because of what they go through when they're young from that parent or family, pre-existing psychological disorders that may play a role in developing more of that, unstable or abusive family experiences during childhood, and genetic predisposition. Okay, next slide. So we have paratrauma during the trauma. Of course, the severity of the trauma is going to play a big role. Perception of the potential for injury also is part of that. Remember, like, their perception a lot of times is a key here. It's like when we look at trauma, or let's say, for instance, crisis, we cannot really go by how our level of crisis or trauma is. We have to be able to look at each individual and to assess that from their point of view, because like a young child going through a crisis or something maybe traumatic might be more so for them than it might be for us. So dissociation from the traumatic event as it occurs. So dissociation is kind of escaping that. It's your dissociating from yourself in a sense, to look at the event a little bit differently. Strong emotional reactions. So a lot of times when we look at this point here, what I always kind of remember is different parts in our system spiritually that play a role. So we have our thoughts, above our heart is like our feelings, and by our belly button is emotions. So a lot of times what happens is those are energy points within the body, traditionally that people may know of. And if those are not dealt with properly, kind of the energy of not dealing with those correctly can get stored. So sometimes over time, people can get more in those areas and they might not be able to deal with that. So, but a lot of times, remember, strong emotional reactions is that if it bothered them so much and hurt them so much internally with their emotions, the more likelihood that it can develop trauma from that. Exposure to horrific events. Now, of course, if you've seen very horrific things happening around you that you've never seen before, of course, that is going to play a role in your experience of that. Okay, next slide, please. So post-trauma, and then then we get into post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think we've talked a lot of that, but one thing we do really acknowledge is that we need social support of these things. This is something that's needed. And a lot of times for a soldier who is away from home, that grounding source may be the spouse and family. And a lot of times we need to make sure that they are part of the treatment process, but they might also need education and things like that to be able to help them understand the veteran and the people who are going through there and what things they might be able to do to help. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so here we have PTSD among American Indian Alaska Native populations. Is only one study compared rates of PTSD at this time between male and female American Indian veterans. There was significantly more PTSD symptoms reported by male compared to female, but a lot of times they placed that as the role they played within the military and a higher likelihood of a chance of being exposed to warfare. And this may change the future generations of veterans as women are increasing, being placed in combat zones and being placed in combat duties and positions within the military. Okay, next slide. So again, this is the last, wait a minute. Okay, module 3. I got to think it was something, a different module. So approaches to assessment and treatment. Ray, go ahead.
Okay, next slide. In this third module, these are the 4 objectives that we have identified for our workshop experience across, once again, 2.5 days. And cultural, we talk about the cultural assessments, talk about the DSM-5, treatment of PTSD, inclusion of family and communities. Next slide. And our purpose for this objective is to review the process involved in figuring out what problem or problems exist, particularly with assessment. Next slide. This is basic, but with many of our family members, especially communities, this is a valuable thing to relate to our people, I think, is that assessment is part of treatment. Next slide. And so we have a discussion on assessment that we go through with our veterans and their families, and these modules that we're showing you now, we also work to include providers as well, so they can have understanding. And in a workshop discussion format, and there's a lot of dialogue that happens between participants. Next slide. And we make note that DSM-5 is there for us to look at and to use as a tool with our families and our veterans. And next slide. PTSD assessment. It's been noted that Native American veterans with combat-related PTSD is sometimes more severe than those with non-combat related PTSD. It's just understanding that does happen. Next slide. Within the cultural context of symptoms, these are some points that we go through with our veteran participants. More notably, that one belief is the belief that the spirit of a past loved one is helping the veteran and their family, and may be labeled as magical thinking sometimes within the Euro-American diagnostic system that we're looking at, or as a delusion. But it's a normal part of our ways and our experiences. Next slide. We look at the diagnostic criteria for PTSD within the DSM. And okay. Third objective looks like this. Our purpose here is that when PTSD is diagnosed, possible treatment approaches can be discussed. Next slide. There's a strength model approach to be addressing PTSD. We'll spend some time on that. Next slide. And what does treatment of PTSD sometimes look like? We go through a discussion on this also. Next slide. Some more treatment approaches. Next slide. What you're getting in 10 segments or less is something we spend a lot of time with our veterans in this module. Talk about suicide prevention planning. Very, very important topic for our veterans, because our veterans nationally, suicide death rate is about 21 per 100,000. Next slide. Objective 4, we look at inclusion of families and community and addressing the adverse experiences of PTSD. This is a drawing made by Navajo healer. Next slide. Some reasons why it's important to include family. Next slide. And why is community participation and involvement important? Well, there's some reasons that we spend a good amount of time going through with our veterans. Next slide. Military families are significant to us who are veterans. Next slide. And it is very common for us to stay in touch with our brothers and sisters that we serve with, regardless of how long that is. Next slide. And we get to module 4. We're not going to go through the next 2 modules because we have some time constraints, as I mentioned, but I think you will be getting the slides and you can look at module 4 and 5 independently. And I think Sean and I, you will have our contact information for Sean and I, so please feel free to connect with us after this session so that we can continue dialogue. If you have interest in hosting 2-3-day workshop in your community, let us know also. But we'll take questions now, okay? Any questions, comments? Want to talk about the traditional healing piece, Sean?
Looks like we have some. Gordon?
Okay.
Yeah, I was just wondering, like Sean was saying when you were in Fort Bragg and how things went. And I was active too, and I was always told to just man up and be quiet. And I mean, that's the way that the old school guys were. Now you have PTSD, you have all the trauma guidelines that you have to go through. But when we already were in there, it was just man up and drive on.
Mhm.
So I was just trying to get to the point where a lot of things changed in the military time from back into the 80s to now. So and PTSD, I know quite a few veterans that have it. I am a whole chunk from Winnebago, Nebraska, and a lot of our veterans coming back, and we have to work with them. And I'm a VSO, so I deal with a lot of our veterans, and what I'm learning here, and then I can bring to them, and we can sit down and talk about it. And thank you guys.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Gordon.
Yeah. What I should mention is that when we go into a community and meet with veterans, family providers, and all, what we work on doing, Sean and I, we have other trainers also that we bring in. We work on, this is a trainer of trainers model. So Gordon, if we were to go to your area, for example, you were to convene a group of veterans with us, we would work with you or somebody on designing these modules to your community and work you through the process of the modules so that you can incorporate that into your work more formally. So that's our intent.
Okay.
Ray, Dara also asked in the chat how you've been utilizing this module, how long and with how many Native veterans, which I think is a nice compliment to the question that Gordon asked. I know you've given this presentation at least a couple of times recently.
Yeah. So directly answering Dana's question, we've done a 2.5-day training in one of the communities in New Mexico, and then the pandemic hit, and of course this is more of a face-to-face kind of workshop because we like to have a lot of dialogue with the veterans in the community there. And since then, we've been able to do the modules once this year. And we have probably 6 to 8 communities that we're in communication with at different stages of implementation of a workshop. This is, you know, if Tohatchi chapter and Navajo Nation said to me today they wanted to do the modules over there, we would go through a very tedious process of planning and designing the modules for the Tohatchi community, for example. We just don't go in and give it and then leave. Then there's a whole series of follow-up that we engage in. Even though it's been over two years since we did this workshop in one of the New Mexico communities, you know, we're still in touch with people from that community, either through messaging, texting, or even collateral discussions as well. So this is a process of teaching and engaging our people in a way that they can carry this knowledge and develop it for themselves.
Yeah, for instance, like if we were going to go into from one community to another, depending upon the distance and the tribal cultural differences, we may not be able to use the same information a lot of times culturally that we would use in another area. Because like down in Arizona, New Mexico, something like that, a lot of them may not want to even refer to a passing or something like that, because within their culture, they just don't talk about it. But in other tribes, they might be very open to that. And I know with our tribe, that's the way it is here. We talk about those processes because we have a whole kind of traditional knowledge of how this process goes, even on the spirit side, so that people know what's going on at that time as they move on. And it's just part of our kind of upbringing. But there's other different cultural things that come into play is, you know, maybe, you know, in one tribe, they might have a ceremony where they, you know, eat puppy or something, or dog, but and others don't. So a lot of times it's like they might not want anything like that in their tribe. So it's something we need to be able to take the cultural sensitivity very you know, it's a very important piece to us, and that we want to make sure that when it crosses into another tribal culture, that it is very culturally relevant. But for people, I mean, we've done this, you know, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 people. But and if you want the whole thing, it takes about 3 days. We do have like this one here that we looked at today is one of the shorter ones, and it's made for 2 days.
Yeah, we have group activities and a lot of roundtable discussions that go on in a formal three-day training process. How do you say that, Dana?
Yakopi.
Yakohi. What language is that?
Choctaw.
Oh, good to meet you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, one thing we do talk about, you might find this kind of interesting, is that it might get you thinking. One of the cultural practices early on, and wasn't always mentioned in things, but there are that of giving, like food and gifts and things like that to people around the area, you know, and let them know that, hey, we're here, we're welcome you, a friendship, stuff like that. But a lot of times it may have been taken wrong in the past. But there was another practice too that we utilized, and that we really took into consideration of them really old beliefs, is that every life is sacred. You do not take a life. And I talk about a story. It's very old, and it talks about two tribes where their warriors are kind of going through their, on the boundaries of their lands, in a sense, that their people are on at that time, and they run into each other. So kind of the gist of it, they meet, they send down their strongest warrior, and all they do is circle each other. It could go on minutes, hours, days. But when they left, finally left and parted, they knew if they had fought, who would have won. So that would get rid of taking a life.
Mm.
We have a couple more questions in the chat. Vernon would like to know what populations you usually interact with, homeless, returning veterans, etc. Is there a universal population you interact with?
Well, the way we've designed it, we were making it more for all peoples, really. For veterans, for professionals working with veterans, for family members, the community, things like that, and to take into a lot of account of what veterans might need. Maybe even, I know we've talked also about differences of the military culture and the civilian culture, and how that maybe natives feel were treated in the military and things like that. Because a lot of times, just because of our cultural background, and they believe that all natives are capable of all these supernatural things. So we're usually given, you know, some of the harshest duties, our most dangerous duties.
And Sonia would like to know if you offer services and assistance for families, which you touched on a little bit in terms of support. Is there value in families of veterans attending this training that you offer?
We would gladly work with some of the, you know, the bill to help out the Native veterans. There are different kind of things that come about with these kind of things that people need to be aware of. I know that with homeless, there's a lot of articles and things out there about it, and that sometimes, whether it's due to mental or physical disabilities or anything like that, that can play a role. Also within a lot of people, like even within tribes itself on the land, even, you know, some people might say, well, there is no homeless. I mean, they always have family they can stay with and stuff like that. A lot of people have started calling couch surfing and things like that. But there's so many more different areas that we can talk about.
Gordon, you have a comment in chat. Do you want to explain that?
Yeah, I work with the VA in Nebraska, and we got a few homeless veterans that we have, combat veterans, that we've been trying to find a placement for them. They do have these COVID houses that we have on the tribe, so we've been trying to purchase them so we could give somebody a house. So that's what the assistant program is going on with the tribe, and we're there's a lot of rules and regulations to what we can do, and so we're just trying to push our way in there, because the VA said, well, we can give so much, and then the tribe says they can try to give so much. So we're trying to work on a couple housing for some veterans, but there's so many different guidelines that we have to come up and take care of first. But we're working on it.
Yeah. Yeah, you're really correct about those guidelines and rules that are, unfortunately, the VA is going through a realignment.
Yeah.
And there are places in native countries where, because of the realignment, clinics and services are being taken away, essentially. So our adjustment to that in the coming months and years, I think is going to be real significant in terms of how it affects our veterans. Blessings to you for what you do there, Gordon, and maybe we'll touch base one day face to face. But thank you for everything you do.
Yep.
Appreciate it.
We have about 3 minutes left. Time perhaps for one more question. We have put the Kipper link in the chat, and we would greatly appreciate it if you would take a few moments to fill out that survey.
Oh, by the way, we are looking for more female veteran trainers. But
Huge.
even in certain areas within tribal lands and stuff, natives or whatever, across the country, if you have residents in certain areas and you'd like to get involved in TOT, we could utilize you in those areas probably later on for trainings. It helps us so we don't have to travel so much either. So part of building capacity. So.
Thank you very much, Sean and Ray. As we mentioned in the chat, we will be posting the recording and the slides within the next couple of days. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we wish you a good day, a good week, and we hope to see you at our next event.
Mhm.